In this short video, what I'm going to do is give you kind of a shortcut or a guide to making sense of the readings. I'm going to go over the readings very, very quickly, but more importantly, apply them to a case study. By now, you should have read your 3 chapters that I've posted throughout Canvas. They're under the readings header, but they're also all appear in Module 3. Some are more comprehensive than others, but we're going to be distilling them down essentially and looking at 3 philosophers. Okay. We're going to look at 3 philosophers and their ethical approaches. And we're going to add this to our other element, which is the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. You should know those 4 by heart now. And then earlier in this module, we added 2 more principles under the SPJ Code of Ethics. These were added by the Poynter Institute, and they include engage the community and seek transparency. They were added really more as a response to the transformative nature of journalism, now that journalism is incorporating a lot more from social media. So our 3 approaches are referred to as virtue-based, duty-based, and consequence-based. And we're going to associate these with different philosophers. We'll go over this in more detail a little bit later on. You should read the readings probably before listening to this movie, or you can watch the movie, go to the readings, and then come back to the movie. But virtue-based ethics are associated with the philosopher Aristotle. And his main thing, or the thing we're going to be using in this class, is this notion of the golden mean. And the golden mean was really a gauge or a lens through which he saw ethical dilemmas. And so the assumption is we're going to look at ethics along a continuum. And then on one end, you have what he referred to as virtue, and the other end, you had what he referred to as vice. Okay, looking at that in a journalistic context, we're going to look at the vice as very sensational journalism. The kinds of things that appear in the New York Post and Newsday, photographs that are over the top, language that is over the top, and so on. A virtue journalism on this continuum would refer more to kind of just the facts, the who, what, when, and where, without any kind of sensational perspective to it. So what Aristotle argued was this middle ground or golden mean, or what I like to refer to as a sweet spot, that what Aristotelian journalism would look like would be journalism that kind of is in this middle ground. It's not overly sensational, but it's not overly dry. It's that middle ground. And let me show you an example of what I mean. You may recall the horrible tragedy that occurred about 2.5 years ago when an employee of a Roanoke television station shot in cold blood a reporter and her cameraman as they were doing a live story in the Smith Mountain area. So here's how 3 different newspapers in the state of Virginia handled this. On the one end, you see the news leader, ex-newsman was Human Powder Keg, and you can see a reflection of the newsman. He was recording these murders himself, and you can see it as a reflection in a window. So that's pretty jarring, right? I would call that an extreme of vice. That's not the kind of thing I really want to see on the front page of a newspaper, and it's not very respectful to the victims and their families. Then on the other end, you have the Roanoke Times with the headline, State of Shock. And so the photograph they chose to put on their front page was of community mourners. Obviously, very, very respectful. And I would put that on the other end of virtue. And in the middle, we have the Virginian Pilot. And I would suggest that this is an example of Aristotle's golden mean or middle ground. That we have tragedy in real time as our headline. And then we have a photograph of the victims, the reporter, Allison Parker, and her newsman, and her cameraman, with the subheader, cameraman and reporter died doing what they loved. So this front page focused on the victims, which is what the story is all about, in a very respectful and tasteful manner. Duty-based ethics, again, you'll read more about this, so this is going to be very brief, refers to ethics that are rule-based, the kinds of things we ought to be doing. With duty-based ethics, there's a clear sense of right and wrong. And we associate duty ethics with the philosopher Kant. And the interesting thing about journalism is to be a good journalist, you have to have a lot of sort of leeway. You have to consider stories and decisions on a case-by-case basis. The thing with duty-based ethics is the lines are drawn. Something is either right or it's wrong. There's not really a lot of middle ground. So what kind of decision would you base if this was duty-driven? Some people look at duty-driven ethics at kind of like the Golden Rule. You may remember studying the Golden Rule in Sunday school. You know, the whole idea of you wouldn't make a decision for someone else that you wouldn't make for yourself or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So you really have to kind of think about, if this were me, what kind of decision would I make? And I think you could use a duty-based argument for either the Roanoke Times or possibly the Virginia Pilot as well. And again, the maxim behind duty-based ethics is you wouldn't make a decision that you wouldn't follow yourself. So definitely the news leader is out. Consequence-based ethics. You may have heard it referred to as utilitarianism or the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So it's all about maximizing joy or good and minimizing harm. And that's associated with the philosopher John Stuart Mill and Bentham. So again, you're interested in outcomes, you're interested in consequences, you're interested in maximizing good. And again, I think you could use that to support the Virginia Pilot's front page as well as the Roanoke Times front page, because they're both minimizing harm. Obviously, the news leader is maximizing harm. So to summarize, throughout the semester, we're going to be looking at virtue ethics as represented by Aristotle and the Golden Mean, duty ethics as represented by Immanuel Kant and his system of rules, and consequential ethics, which is represented by Mill and the greatest good. Again, if these don't make a lot of sense now, they will as we go along, and I will go into these in more depth in another movie.